Your brain runs on one quiet rule. An animal is just one animal. A horse is a horse. A bird is a bird. So when you meet a skull with a horse's long face bolted onto a gorilla's clawed arms, something in you insists it's a hoax. Two creatures glued together in a back room. It isn't. Every animal here was real. It breathed, it fed, it died, and it looked exactly this wrong on purpose. Their bones sit in museum drawers as you listen. Here are 6 real creatures that seem stitched from 2, and all of them lived. Evolution doesn't design anything, it borrows. It takes a leg that already works, a jaw that already works, a claw built for one job, and it drags those parts into shapes that were never meant to share a body. Most of the time, the result looks like an animal you'd recognize, a variation on a theme you already carry in your head. But every so often, the borrowing goes far enough that the finished creature reads like a collision, like 2 familiar animals were pushed together and told to survive. The unsettling part isn't that they look fake, it's that they're the honest ones, and it's our instinct for what a body should be that turns out to be too small. There is no rule that an animal has to make sense to you. These 6 never got the message. We'll start with the one that broke a very famous mind. In 1834, a young naturalist was digging through a gravel bank on a bleak stretch of the Patagonian coast when he pulled out bones that didn't belong to anything he knew. His name was Charles Darwin, and he was still years away from writing a single word about evolution. What he had in his hands made no sense as one animal. It had the long neck and body of a camel or a llama. It had the heavy, weight-bearing legs of a rhinoceros, and its skull carried its nostrils strangely high up the face. The arrangement you tend to see in animals that carry a short trunk. A camel, a rhino, and something with a trunk, folded into a single creature. Darwin crated the bones and sent them home. The anatomist Richard Owen gave the animal a name, Macrauchenia, and then science simply got stuck, because nobody could say what it was related to. For the better part of 2 centuries, this animal drifted across the tree of life with no branch to sit on. It looked like too many things at once. Even the trunk was fought over. Some read those pulled-back nostrils as a small elephant-like proboscis, others as a moose-style nose, and that argument still isn't fully closed. Every attempt to file it beside camels, or rhinos, or anything else, fell apart the moment someone looked harder. It was, quite literally, an animal that refused to be a category. You could hold its skull in your hands and still not be able to say what it was. The answer only arrived in 2017, and it didn't come from the shape of the bones at all. Researchers pulled ancient protein and fragments of mitochondrial DNA straight out of the fossils and read the molecules directly. Macrauchenia turned out to be a distant cousin of horses, rhinos, and tapirs, the last of a lost South American lineage that had been evolving completely alone for tens of millions of years, quietly reinventing the parts of familiar animals from scratch. It walked that continent until roughly 10,000 years ago, sharing the plains with saber-toothed cats and the first humans ever to set foot in the Americas. Its legs were built like a rhino's, not because it was related to rhinos, but because it faced the same problem, carrying a heavy body across open ground. And evolution reached for the same answer twice, on 2 separate branches of life. That's why it fools you. Every part looks borrowed from an animal, you know, and not one part actually was. It didn't look like 2 animals because it was some mongrel. It looked that way because it was the closing chapter of a family we had never met, and never will again. The next one takes that illusion and makes you watch it move. Picture a horse grazing in a field. Now take its head, the long, calm face, the flat herbivore's teeth, and set it on the shoulders of something built like a gorilla. Long, heavy front limbs, shorter back legs, and where you expect hooves, enormous curved claws on the hands. This is Chalicotherium, and it was a real, hoofed, plant-eating mammal that plodded across Europe, Asia, and Africa for millions of years during the age of mammals. The horse's head isn't a loose comparison. It's a genuine relative of horses. It's everything below the neck that stops making sense, because those claws created a problem that an animal that size had to solve every single day. You can't walk on your palms if your hands end in long hooks. You drive the claws into the dirt and wear them blunt with every step. So Chalicotherium did the thing gorillas do. It curled its fingers under and walked on its knuckles, holding the claws up and clear of the ground. A hoofed mammal, a cousin of the horse, moving across the landscape on its knuckles like an ape. When it wanted to feed, it most likely sat back on its haunches, reached up with those long arms, and hooked the claws over high branches to drag the leaves down to that long, horse-like mouth. And when the first fragments were dug up, nobody believed they went together. The teeth said, relative of horses, The claws said giant ground sloth or some kind of clawed meat-eater. For years, the pieces were split apart and filed under different animals because the combination read as flatly impossible. A skull from one kind of creature, hands from a completely different one. That is worth sitting with. Trained scientists, looking at the real bones, concluded that two animals this mismatched simply could not be the same one. The evidence was in front of them and their instincts still said hoax. But they came from a single body. And that body had decided, calmly, across millions of years of evolution, to become a gorilla-shaped horse that walked on its knuckles. It's one of the strangest mammals that ever lived. And it wasn't even the strangest thing walking the Ice Age world at the time. Because further north, on the cold steppe, something was walking around wearing a legend. Every culture that ever told a story about a unicorn was, in a sense, a few thousand years too late to meet the real one. Across the frozen grassland of Ice Age Eurasia lived Chalicotherium, a rhinoceros the size of a mammoth, shaggy with fur against the cold, and carrying on its forehead the reason it earned its nickname, the Siberian unicorn. Its skull bears a huge bony dome, a base so broad and thick that the horn it once anchored may have stood over a metre long. Horn is made of keratin, and keratin rots, so we have never found the horn itself, but the socket it left behind in the bone is enormous, and there's no mistaking what sat there. A horse-shaped head, the bulk of a rhino, and a single vast spike rising over the eyes. For a long time, everyone assumed this creature had died out hundreds of thousands of years ago, tucked safely deep in prehistory where it couldn't touch us. Then the bones were dated properly, and the timeline moved. Chalicotherium survived until roughly 39,000 years ago, which means it was still alive and grazing when modern humans were already spreading across that exact stretch of land. People walked the same frozen plain as a 2-ton, horned, unicorn-shaped animal. Whether any myth traces back to a real memory of it, we can't prove, and probably never will, but the overlap is real. Somebody's ancestors saw this thing on the horizon and had to decide, fast, whether the shape moving through the grass wanted anything to do with them. Imagine watching a 2-ton animal with a spike on its head lower that head to graze, and understanding, in your gut, that there was no story yet that explained it. It wasn't a legend to them. It was Tuesday. What finally killed it wasn't a spear or a trap. As the climate shifted at the end of the Ice Age, the dry grassland it fed on shrank away, and a giant so specialized for one kind of vegetation had nowhere left to go. It simply faded out as the world warmed underneath it. A creature that looks like a fantasy, erased by weather. And that brings us to a pair of hands that look like a nightmare. Attached, it turns out, to something that only ever wanted to eat plants. In 1948, an expedition working the Gobi Desert of Mongolia pulled claws out of the sand. Not modest ones. Curved talons that, measured along the outer edge, could approach a full metre in length. The largest claws of any animal ever discovered, before or since. When the fossils were formally described in the 1950s, the scientists studying them reached for the only thing that seemed to fit, and got it spectacularly wrong. He decided they belonged to a gigantic, turtle-like reptile, some vast ocean creature that used the blades to cut through seaweed. That mistake is fossilized into the animal's scientific name to this day. The truth was far stranger than a giant turtle. Those claws belonged to Therizinosaurus, a dinosaur, and a member of the same broad group that produced the great meat-eaters, the theropods. Everything about that family tree whispers predator. So your mind assembles the obvious monster, a towering killer with metre-long blades on the ends of its arms, the worst thing the entire Cretaceous ever produced. And then the rest of the family's skeletons come in, and the monster quietly dissolves in front of you. Therizinosaurus had a tiny head, a leaf-cropping beak, a wide barrel gut built for fermenting vegetation, and a coat of feathers. It was a plant-eater, a giant, pot-bellied, feathered browser that stood several metres tall and looked, honestly, like a bird crossed with a sloth. Picture that silhouette against a Cretaceous sky. A shaggy, big-bellied shape balanced on bird-like legs, small head swaying at the end of a long neck, and two arms hanging off it that end in the longest blades any living thing has ever grown. So what were the swords for? Almost certainly what a sloth or a gorilla uses long arms and hooks for. Pulling branches in close to feed, and, when a predator wandered too near, making it very clear those blades cut in both directions. That's the quiet horror of Therizinosaurus. Not that it hunted you. It's that it carried the most frightening weapons in the history of life, purely so it could eat leaves in peace. And it would only ever turn them on you if you forced its hand. But at least, in the end, we had its whole body to reason with. The next animal on this list gave science almost nothing to work with, for 50 years. In 1965, in that same Mongolian rock, a joint expedition found a pair of arms. Just arms. Massive ones, nearly 2.5 meters long, ending in big, blunt claws. No skull, no spine. Nothing to say what they were bolted to. The scientists named the owner Deinocheirus, the terrible hand. And then the trail went completely cold. And it stayed cold for half a century. For 50 years, one of the most tantalizing fossils on Earth was a set of giant arms reaching up out of the ground, attached to a total blank. Every artist who tried to sketch the rest of it was, frankly, guessing. When the reveal finally came, in 2014, it was worth every year of the wait, because the body those arms belonged to made no sense on any level. Deinocheirus stretched around 11 meters long. It had a tall sail or hump rising off its back like a bison's shoulders. It had a wide, flat, toothless snout shaped almost exactly like a duck's bill, broad feet, an enormous belly. So this one animal combined the arms of a giant clawed predator, the hump of a bison, the bill of a duck, and the bulk of something approaching a small elephant. It is the closest thing in the entire fossil record to a creature assembled from the spare parts of 4 unrelated animals and somehow switched on. And inside its body cavity, researchers found the last clues to how it actually lived. Hundreds of smooth stomach stones, swallowed to grind up plant matter, and, mixed in among them, the scales and bones of fish. It waded and dredged through river shallows like a colossal duck, gulping down plants and fish together and grinding the whole meal in a gizzard full of gravel. And one of the best skulls we have only reached science because it had been looted out of the country by fossil poachers, smuggled abroad, and had to be tracked across borders and returned before anyone could even confirm what the head of this thing looked like. Think about that gap. For 50 years, the arms sat in a drawer, and every single reconstruction, every painting, every museum guess, every childhood dinosaur book, imagined a lean, fast predator using those claws to kill. The reality was almost the exact opposite of the monster everyone had drawn. The terrible hand, in the end, belonged to a shy, humpbacked, duck-billed fisherman that spent its days wading through mud. And even that looks almost conventional next to the last one, because the last one barely counts as a shape we have words for. Go back far enough, before the dinosaurs, before nearly everything you can picture, to the shallow seas of the Cambrian, 500 million years ago. In a slab of rock from British Columbia, paleontologists found the fossil of a small swimming creature called Opabinia. And when one of them stood up at a scientific meeting in the early 1970s to unveil the reconstruction, the room, by several accounts, burst out laughing. They assumed it had to be a joke. It wasn't. Opabinia had a soft, segmented body, with a row of fins running down each side, ordinary enough for the period. Then it had 5 eyes. 5, mounted up on top of its head. And at the very front, where you'd expect a mouth, it carried a long, flexible hose, like a vacuum cleaner nozzle or a short elephant's trunk, tipped with a cluster of grasping claws. To feed, it stretched that nozzle out ahead of itself, seized prey in the claws at the end, and then curled the whole arm back underneath its body to pass the food into a mouth that pointed backwards. Read that again slowly. 5 eyes scanning the seafloor at once, a grabbing hose for a face, a mouth on the underside, aimed the wrong way. Every one of those features works. This was a real, successful little hunter cruising a real ocean. But there is not a single animal alive today you could point to and say, it's a bit like that. Nothing alive is built like this. Nothing in the last 500 million years has been built quite like this again. Which is exactly why Opabinia is the right place to end. The other 5 look stitched from 2 animals because our brains only carry a small catalogue of shapes, and evolution kept scribbling outside the lines of it. But Opabinia isn't a blend of 2 things you already know. It comes from so early in the history of animal life that the normal body plans hadn't fully settled yet. It's a window onto a moment when life was still trying out combinations that would never be attempted again. It doesn't look fused from 2 creatures. It looks like a rough draft of the very idea of an animal, sketched before anyone agreed on the rules. And here is the part that should sit with you after the rest fades. Almost none of these were found on purpose. Darwin was just passing through. The goby claws surfaced from expeditions that had no idea what they were about to lift out of the sand. The 5-eyed thing lay flat in a piece of shale until someone finally looked closely enough to get laughed at for it. The tree of life has always built stranger things than we could ever invent. And most of them are still down there, folded into rock and amber and thawing permafrost and the raw walls of quarries, waiting for the wrong person to dig in the right place. The next skeleton that stops a room cold is already in the ground right now, already stranger than anything on this list. Someone just hasn't put a spade through the right patch of dirt yet. If moments like this are why you're here, subscribe and stay with us. There are far stranger things still buried, and we are going to keep digging them up.